The Oregon timber country in 1887 was a place where men went to disappear, and Thomas Big Tom McCready had been disappearing for the better part of 3 years. The giant Douglas firs that stretched toward heaven like cathedral spires had become his church, the rhythm of his axe against ancient wood his only prayer. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, Tom had the kind of strength that came from grief turned into labor, loss transformed into purpose. His logging camp sat 15 miles north of the settlement of Cedar Falls, nestled in a valley where the morning mist clung to the tree line like smoke from a dying fire. It was here, in this wilderness sanctuary, that Tom had built his solitary existence after the consumption took his wife Mary and their unborn child back in Minnesota.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The other loggers respected his need for solitude, understanding that some wounds required the kind of silence only the deep woods could provide. On this particular October morning, the air carried the bite of early winter, and the leaves had turned the forest into a tapestry of gold and crimson. Tom was working a section of old-growth timber near Raven Creek, trees so massive that it would take him and his crew the better part of a week to bring down just one. The sound of his axe echoed through the forest in a steady rhythm, each strike precise and powerful, the kind of methodical work that allowed a man's mind to wander while his body stayed busy. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the wind moving through the branches, but as he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he heard it again. A sound so faint it might have been imagination, but Tom had spent enough time in these woods to know the difference between what belonged and what didn't. This sound didn't belong. It was human, weak, and filled with a desperation that made his chest tighten. Tom set down his axe and moved through the underbrush with surprising quiet for such a large man. His boots barely disturbed the carpet of fallen leaves as he followed the sound deeper into the forest, away from the familiar comfort of his worksite. The Douglas firs gave way to a dense thicket of elderberry and wild huckleberry bushes, their branches creating a natural maze that seemed designed to hide secrets. The sound came again, clearer now. It was crying, soft and exhausted, the kind of weeping that came from someone who had run out of strength, but not yet out of hope. Tom pushed through a particularly thick stand of brush and stopped short, his breath catching in his throat at what he found in the small clearing beyond. She was huddled beneath a fallen log, so still that at first glance she might have been mistaken for just another shadow in the dappled forest light. But as Tom's eyes adjusted, he could see the rise and fall of her chest, shallow and irregular. She was young, probably no more than 18 or 19, with long black hair that hung in tangled sheets around her shoulders. Her clothing was traditional Sioux dress, but torn and stained with mud and what looked like blood. Her feet were wrapped in strips of hide that had been worn through in places, and her skin had the grayish pallor that spoke of starvation and exposure. Tom had seen Sioux before, of course. The tensions between the tribes and the growing number of white settlers had been simmering for years, occasionally boiling over into violence that left both sides bloodied and bitter. But he had never seen one like this, alone and clearly dying. In the deep woods, far from any known tribal territory, most of the Sioux had been pushed onto reservations years ago, their traditional hunting grounds carved up and sold to timber companies and railroad barons. As he watched, the young woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to reveal dark brown irises that seemed to hold depths of pain and fear that no one so young should carry. When she saw Tom standing at the edge of the clearing, her body tensed like a deer preparing to bolt, but she was clearly too weak to run. Instead, she pressed herself back against the fallen log, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Tom raised his hand slowly, the universal gesture of peace, and took a careful step back to show he meant no harm. "Easy there," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he had once used to calm spooked horses. "I'm not going to hurt you." The young woman said nothing, but her eyes tracked his every movement with the wariness of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading the intentions of strangers. Tom could see that she was trying to assess whether he represented salvation or just another threat in what had clearly been a long series of dangers. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller and less threatening, and pulled his water canteen from his belt. The sound of the liquid sloshing inside made the young woman's eyes widen slightly, and Tom could see her cracked lips part unconsciously. She was desperately thirsty, that much was obvious, but still cautious enough not to trust easily. "Water," Tom said simply, holding up the canteen so she could see it clearly. "Clean water from the creek up the mountain. You need it more than I do right now." He set the canteen on the ground between them and backed away a few steps, giving her space to decide whether to trust him or not. The young woman stared at the canteen for a long moment, then at Tom's face, searching for signs of deception or malice. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she slowly reached out with a trembling hand and grasped the water container that she drank with the desperate intensity of someone who hadn't had clean water in days, large gulps that spoke of profound thirst. Tom watched as some color returned to her cheeks and her breathing became steadier. When she finally lowered the canteen, she looked at him with something that might have been gratitude, though suspicion still lurked in her dark eyes. "My name is Tom," he said quietly, pointing to himself. "Tom McCready, what's yours?" The young woman hesitated for a long moment, then spoke in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. "Ayana," she said, the syllables flowing like water. "Over stones. It means ... eternal blossom." Her English was accented but clear, suggesting she had learned it well, probably from missionaries or traders. Tom filed that information away, wondering what had brought a young Sioux woman who spoke English to be dying alone in the Oregon wilderness. "Ayana," he repeated carefully, trying to pronounce it the way she had. "That's a beautiful name." You hurt? Besides being hungry and thirsty, I mean." She seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. "My ankle," she said, shifting slightly to reveal a foot that was clearly swollen and probably sprained. "I fell running through the dark 3 nights ago, and my shoulder." She touched her left shoulder gingerly, wincing at the contact. Tom's mind immediately went to practical concerns. She needed food, medical attention, and shelter, and she needed them soon. The nights were getting cold, and in her weakened condition, exposure could kill her as surely as starvation. But there were complications to consider, dangerous ones. That made his jaw tighten as he thought through the implications. The territory around Cedar Falls had been tense lately. There had been reports of Sioux raiding parties moving through the area, hitting isolated homesteads and clashing with army patrols. The local settlers were on edge, and the territorial militia had been conducting sweeps through the forest, looking for signs of hostile Indians. If Tom brought Ayana back to his camp, word would spread quickly, and the consequences could be severe for both of them. But looking at her now, seeing the exhaustion and pain in her young face, Tom knew he couldn't leave her here to die. His conscience wouldn't allow it, and neither would the memory of his late wife Mary, who had always insisted that kindness was the one thing that separated civilized people from savages. "Ayana," he said gently, "I have a cabin about 2 miles from here, and food and supplies to tend your injuries. But I need to know something first. Are you alone out here? Is anyone coming to look for you?" The question seemed to cause her physical pain, and tears welled up in her dark eyes. "My people," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "They are all dead. The soldiers came to our winter camp. They said we were harboring raiders, but we were just trying to survive the coming cold. They killed everyone. My father, my mother, my little brother. I only escaped because I was gathering herbs by the river when the shooting started." Tom felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. He had heard rumors of unauthorized military actions against peaceful Indian camps, but hearing it confirmed by someone who had lived through such a massacre made his hands clench into fists. The idea of soldiers killing women and children in the name of preventing raids was exactly the kind of twisted logic that made him sick. "How long ago?" he asked quietly. 5 days, Ayanna replied. "I have been walking since then, trying to find somewhere safe to hide. But the forest is so big, and I don't know this country. I was lost and starving when you found me." Tom made his decision. "You're not lost anymore," he said firmly, "and you're not going to starve. Can you walk at all, or do I need to carry you?" Ayanna tried to stand, using the fallen log for support, but her injured ankle buckled immediately, and she would have fallen if Tom hadn't moved quickly to catch her.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The contact was brief but electric, and Tom was surprised by the jolt of protectiveness he felt as he steadied her slight form against his massive frame. "Carry it is," he said, scooping her up in his arms as easily as he might lift a child. She was lighter than she should be, probably 20 pounds underweight from her ordeal, and Tom felt another surge of anger at the circumstances that had brought her to this point. As he carried her through the forest toward his cabin, Ayanna remained quiet, her head resting against his shoulder with what seemed like the first real relaxation she had allowed herself in days. Tom found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way her hair smelled like wood smoke and pine needles, the way her breathing gradually slowed and deepened as exhaustion finally overcame vigilance. His cabin was a sturdy structure he had built himself from local timber, with thick walls and a stone chimney that would keep the interior warm even in the harshest winter weather. It was designed for one person, but there was a small loft area that could serve as sleeping quarters for a guest, assuming that guest didn't mind the rustic accommodations. Tom kicked the door open and carried Ayanna inside, setting her carefully on the rough-hewn chair near the fireplace. She looked around the cabin with curious eyes, taking in the simple but functional furnishings, the shelves lined with books, the rifle mounted above the mantelpiece, and the photographs on the wall. That showed Tom with a pretty blonde woman who was obviously his late wife. "This is my home," Tom said unnecessarily, suddenly aware of how humble it must seem compared to whatever life she had known before the massacre. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry, and there's plenty of food." He moved to the stove and began preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork, along with some of the sourdough bread he baked weekly. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at Ayanna, who sat quietly by the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. There was something about her presence that filled the cabin in a way he hadn't experienced since Mary's death. A sense of life and purpose that he had forgotten he was missing. "Tom," Ayanna said suddenly, her voice thoughtful, "why are you helping me? Your people and mine, we are not friends. Many of your people would kill me just for being here." It was a fair question, and one Tom had been asking himself since the moment he decided to bring her home. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I've seen enough killing and hatred to last several lifetimes. Maybe it's time for something different." Ayanna nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected. "In my tribe, we believe that the Great Spirit sometimes puts people in our path to test our character. Perhaps you are my test, or perhaps I am yours." Tom ladled the hot food into a bowl and brought it to her, along with a spoon and a cup of coffee. "Maybe we're both being tested," he said. "And maybe we'll both pass." As Ayanna ate with obvious hunger, Tom found himself watching her carefully, noting the delicate way she moved despite her exhaustion, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet dignity that poverty and suffering hadn't been able to touch. She was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it was more than physical beauty that drew his attention. There was a strength about her, a resilience that spoke of someone who had faced terrible things and refused to be broken by them. "Ayana," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something. This area isn't safe for someone like you right now. There's been trouble between your people and the settlers, and feelings are running high. If anyone finds out you're here, it could mean danger for both of us." She looked up from her food, meeting his eyes directly. "Then why did you bring me here? Why didn't you just leave me in the forest to die quietly where no one would know?" It was another fair question, and one that got to the heart of Tom's own moral struggle. "Because leaving you to die would have made me no better than the animals who killed your family," he said firmly. "And because some things are worth the risk." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand. And I promise you, I will not bring trouble to your home if I can help it. But Tom McCready, you should know that trouble may come whether we invite it or not. There are men in this territory who believe that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And they will not care that you saved my life or that I have done nothing to harm anyone." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air outside. He knew she was right, knew that his decision to help her had set in motion a chain of events that could easily spiral beyond his control. But looking at her now, seeing the gratitude and trust beginning to replace the fear in her eyes, he knew he would make the same choice again. "Then we'll face that trouble when it comes," he said quietly, "together." As the evening wore on, Tom tended to Ayana's injuries with supplies from his well-stocked medicine kit. Her ankle was badly sprained but not broken, and her shoulder bore the marks of a grazing bullet wound that had healed poorly during her flight through the wilderness. As he cleaned and rebandaged the wounds, he found himself fighting an unexpected tenderness that went far beyond simple compassion for a fellow human being in need. As Ayana slept in the cabin's small loft, and Tom kept watch by the dying fire, he stared out the window at the dark forest and wondered what he had gotten himself into. He was a simple man who had come to the wilderness to escape the complications of civilization. But now he found himself at the center of a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. But as he listened to Ayana's quiet breathing from the loft above, Tom realized that for the first time in 3 years, his cabin felt like a home again, instead of just a place to sleep between long days of hard labor. Whatever came next, whatever price he might have to pay for his decision to save her, he was already certain it would be worth it. The forest outside remained silent, but Tom knew that silence wouldn't last. Somewhere out there, forces were already in motion that would test everything he believed about right and wrong, about duty and compassion, about the kind of man he wanted to be in a world that seemed determined to bring out the worst in everyone. But for now, in this moment of quiet peace, Tom McCready was content to sit by his fire and guard the sleep of a young woman who had already begun to change his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. That the dawn brought more than just light to the Oregon wilderness. It brought riders. Tom McCready was splitting kindling behind his cabin when he heard the distant thunder of hooves echoing through the valley. His hands stilled on the axe handle as he counted the rhythm, at least 6 horses, maybe more, moving fast and with purpose. In 3 years of solitary living in these woods, Tom had learned to read the forest's moods like a farmer reads the sky. And everything about this morning felt wrong. He glanced up at the cabin's small loft window, where Ayana still slept, her first real rest in nearly a week. The healing had begun during the night. He could see it in the way her breathing had deepened, the way some of the terrible tension had finally left her shoulders. But now, as the sound of approaching horses grew louder, Tom realized their brief sanctuary was about to be shattered. Moving with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to danger, Tom slipped back into the cabin and climbed the ladder to the loft. Ayana was already awake, her dark eyes alert and frightened as she listened to the approaching riders. She had heard them too, and the look on her face told Tom she knew exactly what their arrival might mean. "How many?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. 6, maybe 8, Tom replied grimly. Could be army patrol, could be territorial militia, could be something worse. He met her eyes directly. Either way, you can't be seen here. The cabin had been built with more than just comfort in mind. Tom's years as a Union soldier during the war had taught him the value of defensive positioning and escape routes. Behind the false wall at the back of the loft was a narrow space, barely large enough for one person, that connected to a hidden tunnel leading to a root cellar built into the hillside behind the cabin. It wasn't comfortable, but it was invisible. To anyone who didn't know exactly where to look, Tom quickly helped Ayana into the hidden space, passing her water, some bread, and his hunting knife. Whatever happens, he said urgently, don't come out until I give you the all-clear signal. 3 short knocks, then 2 long ones. If you hear gunfire, use the tunnel to reach the root cellar, then follow the creek bed north to the old beaver. Dam. Wait there until nightfall, then head for the Willamette Valley. There are Quaker settlements there that might help you. Ayana gripped his hand tightly. What about you? I'll handle whatever this is, Tom said with more confidence than he felt. I'm just a logger minding his own business. They've got no quarrel with me. The riders had reached the clearing now, their horses snorting and stamping in the crisp morning air. Tom sealed the false wall and climbed down from the loft, taking a moment to smooth his hair and ensure his cabin looked like the home of a man who had been peacefully going about his morning routine. The knock on his door came hard and demanding, the kind of authoritative hammering that expected immediate compliance. Tom opened it to find himself facing 6 men in a mixture of army blue and civilian clothes, all armed and all wearing the kind of grim expressions that suggested they weren't here for a social visit. The man at the front was tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore a lieutenant colonel's insignia, but his uniform was dusty and travel-stained, suggesting he'd been in the field for some time. His pale blue eyes swept over Tom with calculating intensity. You Tom McCready? The officer asked without preamble. I am, Tom replied carefully. And you are? Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, Territorial Militia. We're conducting a search of this area for hostiles. Indian raiders hit a supply wagon 2 days ago, killed 3 men and made off with weapons and ammunition. We have reason to believe they might be hiding in these woods. Tom kept his expression neutral despite the cold knot forming in his stomach. Haven't seen any Indians around here, Colonel. These woods are pretty quiet most of the time. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. Mind if we take a look around? Check your property, make sure everything's secure. It wasn't really a request, and they both knew it. Tom stepped aside with apparent reluctance. I suppose that's your right, though I don't appreciate having my privacy invaded without cause. These are dangerous times, Mr. McCready, Whitmore said as his men began spreading out to search the cabin. We can't afford to take chances when it comes to Indian raiders. I'm sure you understand. As the soldiers moved through his home, examining every corner and shadow, Tom fought to keep his breathing steady. One of them was a tracker, a grizzled man with sharp eyes who moved through the cabin like a bloodhound, studying the floor for signs that didn't belong. Tom watched nervously as the tracker paused near the fireplace, then by the table where Ayana had eaten the night before. Colonel, the tracker said quietly, there's been someone else here recently. Someone small, light on their feet, and there's food missing from what a man living alone would normally consume. Whitmore's attention sharpened like a blade. Explain. The tracker pointed to barely visible scuff marks on the wooden floor. Boot prints here, but also moccasin tracks. Fresh ones less than a day old. And see this? He indicated the area around the table. Crumbs from 2 meals, not 1. Someone else was eating here last night. Tom's mind raced as he tried to formulate an explanation that wouldn't immediately condemn both him and Ayana. I had a visitor yesterday, he said carefully. Fellow logger from the McPherson camp stopped by on his way south. We shared dinner. And he moved on this morning. What was his name? Whitmore demanded. Jake Morrison, Tom lied smoothly, picking a name common enough to be believable. Big fellow, red beard, works the crosscut saw for McPherson's crew. The tracker was still studying the floor, his weathered face creased in concentration. These moccasin tracks, he said slowly. They're small. Too small for any logger I've ever seen. And the gait is wrong, shorter steps, different weight distribution. Colonel, these tracks were made by an Indian woman. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees as Whitmore's face hardened into granite. Mr. McCready, he said, with deadly quiet, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I suggest you think very carefully before you answer. Have you seen any Indians in this area? Tom met the colonel's stare without flinching. Like I told you, no sir. Just me and the trees out here. One of the soldiers called out from the loft. Colonel, you might want to see this. Whitmore climbed the ladder with Tom close behind, his heart hammering against his ribs. The soldier was holding up a small piece of beadwork that must have fallen from Ayana's torn dress during the night. The intricate pattern was unmistakably Sioux craftsmanship, the kind of detail work that would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with Indian artifacts. Well, well, Whitmore said softly, turning the beadwork over in his hands. It seems our Mr. McCready has been less than truthful with us. Tom's mind went blank for a moment, then desperation sparked inspiration. I found that in the woods yesterday, he said quickly. Figured it might be worth something to a trader, so I brought it home. Guess I forgot about it. You forgot about finding Indian beadwork in your own territory? Whitmore's voice dripped skepticism. How remarkably convenient. The tracker had climbed into the loft as well, and was now examining every inch of the small space. Tom watched in growing dread as the man's eyes swept over the false wall, noting slight irregularities in the wood grain that would be invisible to most people, but glaring obvious to someone trained to spot hidden things. Colonel, the tracker said quietly, this wall's been disturbed recently. See how the dust pattern doesn't match the rest of the loft? And there's fresh sawdust in these cracks, like someone's been working on it. Tom's blood turned to ice as Whitmore approached the false wall with predatory interest. Mr. McCready, the colonel said conversationally, the penalty for harboring hostile Indians is death by hanging. The penalty for lying to federal officers during a military investigation is 20 years at hard labor. Right now, you're looking at both charges. I don't know what you're talking about, Tom said desperately. That's just a storage space I built last month for winter supplies. Then you won't mind if we take a look inside, Whitmore replied, drawing his sidearm. Stand back. The next few seconds stretched like hours as Whitmore examined the wall, looking for the mechanism that would reveal the hidden space. Tom's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he calculated distances and angles, wondering if he could reach his rifle before the soldiers could stop him. But even if he could somehow fight his way out of the cabin, what? Then, he and Ayana would be fugitives, hunted through the wilderness by men who knew these woods almost as well as he did, just as Whitmore's fingers found the nearly invisible catch that would open the false wall. A new sound echoed through the forest. Gunshots, rapid and sustained, coming from the direction of the main logging road. The sound was unmistakably that of a battle, multiple weapons firing in anger. Colonel, one of the soldiers called from outside. Riders coming fast from the south. Looks like trouble. Whitmore hesitated, his hand still on the wall catch, torn between investigating Tom's cabin and responding to what sounded like an active engagement. The gunfire intensified, and Tom could hear shouting voices mixing with the crack of rifles. Sergeant Collins, Whitmore barked. Take 2 men and secure this cabin. No one goes in or out until we return. The rest of you, mount up. We've got Indians to catch." As the majority of the patrol thundered away toward the sound of battle, Tom found himself under guard by 3 grim-faced soldiers who clearly considered him a potential enemy. Sergeant Collins was a heavy-set man with small, mean eyes and the kind of perpetual scowl that suggested he enjoyed his work a little too much. "Sit down and shut up," Collins ordered, gesturing toward a chair with his rifle. "And don't even think about trying anything clever. The colonel might want you alive for questioning, but accidents happen all the time in Indian country." Tom sat carefully, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. The gunfire in the distance suggested that Whitmore's patrol had found the Indians they were looking for, but something about the timing felt wrong. Had Ayana's people somehow survived the massacre she described? Were they launching some kind of rescue mission? Or was this something else entirely, a coincidence that might either save them or damn them completely? The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The distant gunfire had faded, but there was no sign of Whitmore's return. Tom sat under the watchful eyes of his guards, listening for any sound from the hidden space behind the false wall. Ayana had to be terrified, trapped in that cramped darkness while strange voices filled her temporary sanctuary, but she remained absolutely silent. Tom found himself marveling at her self-control, her ability to endure yet another ordeal without panic or despair. As the afternoon wore on, one of the guards, a young private who looked barely old enough to shave, began to fidget nervously. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "shouldn't the colonel be back by now? That gunfight ended hours ago." Collins spat into the fireplace, where the saliva hissed against the hot stones. "Indians are tricky bastards, son. Probably led the colonel on a merry chase through the woods. They'll be back when they're back." But Tom could see uncertainty in the sergeant's eyes, a growing worry that suggested not everything was going according to plan. As the shadows lengthened and evening approached, that uncertainty began to spread to the other guards as well. It was nearly sunset when they heard horses approaching again, but something was wrong with the sound. Instead of the confident thunder of a returning patrol, these hoofbeats were irregular, desperate. When the riders finally appeared in the clearing, Tom's heart sank. Only 2 men returned, and both were wounded. One was slumped over his horse's neck, blood seeping through his uniform shirt. The other, a corporal with a bandaged head, was barely staying in his saddle. "Jesus Christ," Collins breathed, rushing outside to help the wounded men. "What happened? Where's the colonel?" "Dead," the corporal gasped as Collins helped him dismount. "They're all dead. It was a trap, dozens of them waiting in ambush. We rode right into it like damn fools." Tom felt the world tilt sideways as the implications hit him. Whitmore and most of his patrol were dead, which meant the immediate threat to Ayana was gone. But it also meant that word of the massacre would spread, bringing more soldiers, more patrols, more desperate men looking for someone to blame. "What about the Indians?" Collins demanded. "Did you get any of them?" The wounded corporal shook his head weakly. "They scattered after the ambush. Could be anywhere by now. Could be watching us right now for all we know." Collins's face went white as he realized their position. They were isolated, outnumbered, and facing an unknown number of hostile Indians who had just proven they could outfight trained soldiers. His eyes darted to Tom, then to the cabin, then back to his wounded comrades. "We need to get back to Cedar Falls," the corporal continued. "Get reinforcements. Report what happened. This whole territory is going to explode when word gets out." "What about him?" Collins jerked his thumb toward Tom. The colonel thought he was hiding something. The corporal glanced at Tom with pain-dulled eyes. "Leave him. We've got bigger problems now than one suspicious logger. If there's an Indian uprising coming, we need every man we can get back at the fort." Collins clearly wanted to argue, but the reality of their situation was undeniable. With only 3 effective soldiers and 2 of them wounded, They couldn't afford to waste time on investigations that might or might not lead anywhere. "You're lucky, Macready," Collins snarled as he helped secure the wounded men for travel. "But don't think this is over. When we come back, and we will come back, we're going to tear this place apart board by board until we find whatever you're hiding." Tom watched silently as the soldiers prepared to leave, fighting to keep relief from showing on his face. As the small group rode away into the gathering darkness, he waited until their hoofbeats had faded completely before moving to the loft and giving the all-clear signal. The false wall opened to reveal Ayana, cramped and frightened but unharmed. She practically fell into Tom's arms as he helped her out of the hiding space, her body shaking with reaction to hours of terror and confinement. "I heard everything," she whispered against his chest. "The colonel, the tracker, the fighting. Tom, those men who died, my people didn't kill them." Tom held her tightly, feeling the tremors that ran through her slight frame. "What do you mean?" "The attack the soldiers described. The ambush, that's not how my people fight. We don't set traps for whole patrols. We avoid soldiers whenever possible." Ayana pulled back to look at him directly. "Someone else killed those men. Someone who wanted it to look like an Indian attack." The implications of her words sent a chill down Tom's spine. If Ayana was right, then someone was deliberately stirring up conflict between the settlers and the tribes, using the very real tensions to cover their own agenda. But who would benefit from an Indian war? And more importantly, what did it mean? For him and Ayana? "We can't stay here," Ayana said quietly. "More soldiers will come, and next time they won't be distracted by gunfights. They'll search until they find me." Tom knew she was right, but the thought of leaving his home, the sanctuary he had built from grief and hope, felt like tearing out his own heart. This cabin represented 3 years of healing, 3 years of finding peace in solitude and honest work. But looking at Ayana's face, seeing the trust and desperation in her dark eyes, he realized that some things were more important than places, no matter how much they meant. "Then we'll leave," he said simply. "Tonight, before they can organize a proper search. I know places in these mountains where we can hide, places where no patrol will ever find us." "Tom," Ayana said softly, "you don't understand what you're giving up. Your home, your life, your people. Once you help me escape, you can never come back. You'll be branded a traitor, hunted like an animal." Tom cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, marveling at the softness of her skin and the strength in her eyes. "My life was already over," he said quietly. "I've been dead inside for 3 years, just going through the motions of living. You changed that. You brought me back to life, and I'm not about to let them kill you for it." As they prepared to abandon the cabin and flee into the wilderness, Tom took one last look around the home he had built with such care and hope. Tomorrow it would be searched and probably burned, another casualty in a conflict that seemed designed to destroy everything good and decent in its path. But as he helped Ayana gather supplies for their flight, Tom realized that home wasn't a place after all. It was a feeling, a sense of belonging and purpose that had nothing to do with walls and foundations. And for the first time in years, Tom Macready felt like he was finally going home. The forest waited outside, dark and full of unknown dangers. But it also offered freedom, the chance to build something new from the ashes of what they were leaving behind. And as they slipped away into the night, Tom knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The mountain trail wound through Douglas fir and western hemlock like a serpent's backbone, climbing steadily toward the high country where few men dared to venture. Tom Macready moved with the silent confidence of someone who had walked these paths 100 times. But tonight every shadow seemed to hold danger. Every sound of wind through the trees might mask the approach of pursuing horses. Behind him, Ayana followed with the fluid grace of someone born to wilderness travel, her injured ankle wrapped tightly but no longer slowing her down. 3 days of Tom's cooking and care had restored much of her strength, and the desperate flight from his cabin had awakened survival instincts that had kept her alive through the massacre and its aftermath. They had been traveling for 6 hours, climbing steadily away from the familiar logging roads toward a destination Tom had never shared with another living soul. Devil's Canyon was a slash in the Cascade Mountains that most locals avoided, a place where the rock walls rose so steep and close that sunlight barely penetrated to the canyon floor, even at midday. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and absolutely perfect for 2 fugitives who needed to disappear completely. "Tom," Ayanna whispered as they paused at a rocky outcropping to catch their breath. "There are riders behind us. I can hear them." Tom strained his ears and caught what she had noticed, the distant sound of shod hooves on stone, still far below but definitely following their trail. He cursed silently, knowing that Collins had been more resourceful than he'd given the sergeant credit for. Instead of waiting for reinforcements from Cedar Falls, the man had obviously organized a pursuit using local volunteers and whatever soldiers could be spared from other duties. "How many?" Tom asked quietly. Ayanna closed her eyes, focusing on the sounds that drifted up from the valley below. Her people had trained her from childhood to read the wilderness like a book, to extract information from the slightest variations. In natural sound, 8 horses, maybe 9. Moving fast, but they're pushing too hard for this terrain. Their mounts will be exhausted long before they reach the high country. Tom felt a grim satisfaction at her assessment. Collins was a soldier, not a woodsman, and he was making the classic mistake of treating a wilderness pursuit like a cavalry charge across open ground. The sergeant's urgency would work against him in terrain that demanded patience and careful navigation. "There's a place about 2 miles ahead where the trail splits 3 ways," Tom said, shouldering his pack again. "We'll take the middle path into Devil's Canyon. Even if they follow us that far, the canyon has a dozen different exits. They'll never be able to cover them all." As they resumed their climb, Tom found himself stealing glances at Ayanna, marveling at her resilience and grace under pressure. Most people would have been paralyzed by terror at the thought of armed men hunting them through the wilderness, but she moved with calm determination, her dark eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead for obstacles or opportunities. "You've done this before," Tom observed quietly. "Running from soldiers, I mean." Ayanna nodded, her expression growing distant. "Many times, even before the massacre. The army has been pushing our people for years, driving us from traditional hunting grounds, forcing us onto reservations where the land cannot support our families. Sometimes we had no choice but to run." "Is that why you speak English so well?" Tom asked. "Because you've had to deal with soldiers and government officials?" "My father was a chief, but he was also a practical man," Ayanna replied. "He knew that understanding our enemies was the key to surviving them. He sent me to the mission school for 3 years, where I learned to read and write and speak like a white woman. He said knowledge was a weapon that could never be taken away." Tom felt a pang of sadness at the matter-of-fact way she spoke about survival strategies that should never have been necessary. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Ayanna said softly, "right up until the moment they shot him down like a dog in front of his own lodge." The trail began to narrow as they approached the entrance to Devil's Canyon, the massive stone walls rising on either side like the gates to some ancient fortress. Tom had discovered this place during his first winter in Oregon, following a wounded elk that had led him deeper into the mountains than he had ever ventured before. The canyon was a geological marvel, carved by millions of years of water erosion into a labyrinth of passages, caves, and hidden valleys that seemed to exist outside the normal world. "My God," Ayanna breathed as they entered the canyon proper, her voice echoing off the towering walls. "This place feels sacred, ancient." Tom understood what she meant. There was something about Devil's Canyon that made a person feel insignificant, humbled by forces far greater than human ambition or conflict. The walls rose 300 feet on either side, their surfaces carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that resembled faces, animals, and symbols that seemed almost deliberate. The local tribes have stories about this place, Tom said, as they navigated the narrow trail that wound along the canyon floor. They say it's where the spirits of the earth come to dream, and that mortals who disturb those dreams never find their way out again. Do you believe in spirits, Tom McCready? Ayanna asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Tom considered the question carefully. I've seen enough unexplainable things in my life to keep an open mind. And being in places like this, ... He gestured at the cathedral-like space around them. It's hard not to feel like you're in the presence of something larger than yourself. They had been walking through the canyon for nearly an hour when they encountered the first sign that they weren't alone. Ayanna spotted it first, a faint wisp of smoke rising from somewhere deeper in the canyon, barely visible against the dark stone walls. Campfire, Tom said grimly. But who would be camping in a place like this? Outlaws, perhaps, Ayanna suggested. Men who need to hide from the law, or ... Or other Indians, Tom finished, understanding her unspoken concern. People like you, looking for a place where the soldiers can't follow. The possibility changed everything. If there were other Native Americans hiding in Devil's Canyon, Tom and Ayanna might find allies, or they might find themselves caught between two groups of armed men, with every reason to distrust each other. Tom's presence would complicate any encounter with Indians who had good reason to hate white men, while Ayanna's tribe affiliations might not guarantee safety among people from different nations who had their own grievances and territorial disputes. We need to know who we're dealing with, Tom said finally. But we approach carefully, ready to run if things go bad. They followed the smoke to its source, moving with exaggerated caution through the twisting passages of the canyon. The campfire turned out to belong to a group unlike anything Tom had expected. 4 men and 2 women, clearly Indian but from different tribes, sitting around a small fire that had been carefully positioned to minimize the visibility of its smoke. The oldest member of the group was a weathered man with gray-streaked braids and the bearing of a warrior. When he saw Tom and Ayanna approaching, he rose smoothly to his feet, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. The others followed his lead, creating a defensive line that spoke of people accustomed to danger. That's far enough, the older man said in clear English, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. State your business here, white man. Tom raised his hands to show he carried no weapons, while Ayanna stepped slightly forward to take the lead in what could be a crucial negotiation. I am Ayanna of the Minneconjou Lakota, she said formally, using the traditional greeting of her people. This man is Tom McCready, who saved my life and has protected me from the soldiers who murdered my family. The older man's expression shifted slightly, surprise replacing suspicion. Minneconjou? From which band? Chief Running Bear's people, Ayanna replied. We wintered in the valley of the greasy grass before the soldiers came. The man's face went hard with recognition and sympathy. I know of that massacre. We heard the smoke talk from the eastern tribes. Your people fought bravely before they fell. One of the women in the group, a striking figure with premature white streaks in her black hair, stepped forward. I am white. Dove of the Nez Perce. If this man truly saved you from the soldiers, then he is welcome at our fire. The formalities of introduction continued as Tom and Ayanna learned the stories of their unexpected companions. The group was indeed composed of refugees from different tribes, Nez Perce, Crow, and Yakama, all fleeing various forms of persecution and violence. They had found each other during their wanderings and formed a temporary alliance for mutual protection and survival. We call ourselves the people of the Lost Trails, explained the older man, who introduced himself as Joseph Running Wolf of the Crow Nation. We are men and women who have no reservations to return to, no chiefs to follow, no homes that have not been burned by soldiers. We survive by staying hidden, by moving when we must, by helping others who flee the same devils that hunt us. As they shared food around the fire, Tom learned more about the complex web of conflict and displacement that had driven these people into hiding. Each had a story of loss and betrayal, of promises broken and families destroyed by the relentless westward expansion of white settlement. "But you, Tom McCready," said White Dove, studying him with intelligent dark eyes, "what drives a white man to risk everything for one of us? What do you gain by making yourself an enemy of your own people?" It was a fair question, and one that Tom had been asking himself since the moment he decided to help Ayanna. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes sense," he said slowly. "But I've seen enough death and hatred to last several lifetimes. When I found Ayanna dying in the forest, I had a choice: leave her to die, or remember what it means to be human. I chose to be human." Joseph Running Wolf nodded approvingly. "That is a good answer. Many men of all colors have forgotten what it means to be human. They think strength comes from causing pain, that victory requires the complete destruction of their enemies." The conversation was interrupted by a distant sound that made everyone around the fire freeze, the echo of horses echoing through the canyon. Still far away, but definitely getting closer. "Collins," Tom said grimly. "I was hoping the canyon would discourage him, but the man's more persistent than I gave him credit for." "How many?" Joseph Running Wolf asked, already moving to scatter the fire and eliminate any trace of their presence. 8 or 9 riders, Ayanna replied. "Soldiers and militia, heavily armed and determined to capture us. The older warriors." Expression grew thoughtful as he considered their options. "This canyon has many passages, but most of them lead to dead ends or drops that would kill a horse. There are only 3 ways out the way you came: the northern passage that leads to the high peaks, and the western trail that eventually reaches the Willamette Valley. They'll split up to cover all 3 routes," Tom realized. "Even if we avoid them tonight, they'll just wait at the exits until we're forced to come out. Unless," said White Dove with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "we give them something else to think about." The plan that emerged from their hurried conference was as dangerous as it was audacious. The people of the Lost Trails would create a diversion, leading Collins and his men on a chase through the canyon's most treacherous passages while Tom and Ayanna escaped through a route so difficult that no sane person would attempt it: a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall, 300 feet above the floor, leading to a hidden cave system that connected to the northern exit. "The Shadow Walk," Joseph Running Wolf called it, his expression grave as he described the route. "My grandfather told me stories of warriors who used it in the old days, but I have never attempted it myself. The ledge is barely wide enough for one person, and one mistake means death." Tom studied the canyon wall in the flickering firelight, trying to trace the path the older man described. The ledge was there, just visible as a slightly darker line against the stone, but it looked impossibly narrow and exposed. "I'll go first," Tom said finally. "If anyone's going to fall, it should be me." "No," Ayanna said firmly. "I know that kind of terrain. My people have hidden trails like this in the Black Hills. I should lead." As they prepared for the most dangerous part of their escape, Tom found himself marveling at the courage of the people around him. Joseph Running Wolf and his companions were risking their lives for 2 strangers, simply because it was the right thing to do. Their willingness to help proved that humanity and compassion could survive even in the midst of the brutal conflict that was tearing the territory apart. The diversion began just as Collins and his men entered the main canyon. The people of the Lost Trails made themselves visible just long enough to draw pursuit, then melted into the labyrinthine passages like ghosts. The sounds of pursuit echoed through the canyon, shouting voices, horses' hooves on stone, the occasional gunshot as nervous soldiers fired at shadows. While Collins and his men chased phantoms through the maze, Tom and Ayanna began their ascent to the Shadow Walk. The climb to reach the ledge was treacherous enough, requiring them to scale nearly vertical rock faces using handholds that were often no more than cracks in the stone. Tom's size and strength served him well, but Ayanna moved with an almost supernatural grace, finding routes up the rock face that he would never have seen. When they finally reached the ledge, Tom understood why it was called the Shadow Walk. The narrow path was barely 18 inches wide, carved into the canyon wall by some ancient geological process. 300 feet below, the canyon floor looked like another world, while above them the walls continued upward for another 100 feet, creating a sense of being suspended in space. "Don't look down," Ayanna advised as she began moving along the ledge with careful, measured steps. "Feel for each foothold. Test it before you trust it with your full weight. And whatever you do, don't think about how far we could fall." The traverse of the Shadow Walk took nearly 2 hours, each step a careful negotiation with gravity and fear. Several times, pieces of the ledge crumbled away under their feet, sending rocks tumbling into the abyss below. Tom found himself pressed against the canyon wall so tightly that the stone scraped against his chest, his fingers finding purchase in cracks that seemed too small to support his weight. Halfway across, they encountered the most dangerous section, a gap in the ledge where some ancient rockfall had taken out 20 feet of the path. The only way across was to climb higher, following a system of natural handholds and small ledges that required them to move like spiders across a vertical wall. "Tom," Ayanna called softly as they navigated this obstacle. "Below us, do you see?" Tom risked a glance downward and saw Collins and his men far below, their torches creating tiny pools of light as they searched the canyon floor. The soldiers looked frustrated and increasingly desperate, firing their weapons at every shadow that might conceal an enemy. "They're lost," Tom realized. Joseph running Wolf's people led them so deep into the maze that they can't find their way back out. "Good," Ayanna replied grimly. "Let them wander in circles until their horses collapse. Maybe then they'll understand what it feels like to be hunted." When they finally reached the cave system that marked the end of the Shadow Walk, both Tom and Ayanna collapsed in exhaustion, their nerves frayed by hours of mortal danger. The caves were a relief after the exposed ledge, providing shelter and concealment while they recovered their strength. "We did it," Tom said wonderingly, still hardly believing they had survived the traverse. "We actually made it across." Ayanna leaned against him, her body trembling with reaction. "My grandfather used to say that the spirits protect those who fight for justice. Perhaps he was right." As they rested in the safety of the caves, listening to the distant echoes of Collins's frustrated search, Tom realized that something fundamental had changed between them during their time with the people of the Lost Trails. They were no longer just a rescuer and refugee thrown together by circumstance. They had become partners, allies who trusted each other completely. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked quietly. "Where do we go from here?" Tom considered the question carefully. The northern exit from the canyon would take them into the high country, where they could travel undetected toward the Canadian border. But that path led to exile, to a life of permanent hiding from a world that would never forgive their choices. "I've been thinking about what Joseph Running Wolf said," Tom replied slowly. "About remembering what it means to be human. Maybe running away isn't enough anymore. Maybe it's time to stand and fight." Ayanna looked at him with surprise and growing understanding. "You want to go back? To expose whoever is staging these attacks, whoever killed those soldiers and blamed my people. Someone is using this conflict for their own purposes," Tom said with growing conviction. "They're getting rich while innocent people die on both sides. If we can prove that, if we can show people the truth, we could stop a war," Ayanna finished. "But Tom, it would mean going back into the heart of danger. Collins will still be hunting us, and now we'll have whoever staged that ambush to worry about as well, Tom nodded grimly. I know, but hiding in the wilderness for the rest of our lives isn't really living. And if we don't do something, how many more people will die? How many more families will be destroyed? As dawn broke over Devil's Canyon, Tom McCready and Ayanna made a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. Instead of fleeing to safety, they would return to face their enemies. They would seek the truth that could prevent a war, or die trying. The hunt was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The town of Cedar Falls had transformed in the weeks since. Tom McCready and Ayanna had fled into the wilderness. What had once been a sleepy logging community now resembled an armed camp, with barricades erected at every approach and armed patrols walking the streets at all hours. Fear hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire, thick and choking, turning neighbor against neighbor and friend against friend. From their hiding place in the abandoned sawmill on the outskirts of town, Tom and Ayanna watched the transformation with growing unease. They had returned under cover of darkness, following game trails and creek beds that Tom knew from his years of solitary hunting. The mill had been shut down 2 years earlier when the owner fled east after a series of mysterious accidents, and its empty buildings provided perfect concealment for two people who needed to observe without being seen. Look at them, Ayanna whispered as they watched a patrol of armed civilians march past their hiding spot. They're terrified of shadows. Someone has filled their heads with stories of savage Indians lurking in every forest, waiting to murder them in their beds. Tom studied the faces of the men in the patrol, recognizing several as loggers he had worked alongside during his first months in Oregon. These were not cruel men by nature, but fear had twisted them into something ugly and dangerous. They carried their weapons like talismans against an evil they didn't understand, their eyes darting constantly toward the tree line, as if expecting an attack at any moment. Fear makes people stupid, Tom observed quietly. And stupid people are easy to manipulate. That had been the pattern they'd observed during 3 days of careful surveillance. Someone was systematically spreading rumors and stoking panic throughout Cedar Falls, turning every unusual sound into evidence of Indian activity and every missing chicken into proof of impending massacre. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, until half the town was convinced that thousands of bloodthirsty warriors were massing in the surrounding forests. Tom and Ayanna had also noticed something else, a pattern to the panic that suggested careful orchestration rather than random fear. The rumors always seemed to originate from the same sources, spread by the same handful of men who had appeared in town shortly after the massacre of Whitmore's patrol. These men claimed to be representatives of various territorial authorities, but their stories didn't quite match and their credentials were suspiciously vague. There, Ayanna pointed toward the town's main street, where a familiar figure was holding court outside the general store. That's the one who calls himself Deputy Marshal Henderson. He's been telling everyone that the territorial governor has authorized shoot on-site orders for any Indians found off the reservations. Tom focused on the man in question, tall, thin, with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of sharp features that suggested intelligence and ruthlessness in equal measure. Henderson had arrived in Cedar Falls 3 days after Whitmore's death, claiming to represent federal authority and demanding immediate action against the Indian threat. His presence had galvanized the town's fear into organized hatred, turning panic into purpose. I don't think he's a real deputy marshal, Tom said slowly. I've met federal lawmen before, and they don't operate like this. They gather evidence, follow procedures, work through official channels. This Henderson character is more like a provocateur. What's a provocateur? Ayanna asked. Someone who stirs up trouble for their own purposes, Tom explained. During the war, both sides used them to turn civilian populations against each other, to create chaos that could be exploited for military or political gain. As they watched, Henderson finished his speech and moved through the crowd, shaking hands and speaking quietly with specific individuals. Tom noted that these were always the town's most influential citizens, the bank president, the territorial representative, the leaders of the various merchant associations. Whatever Henderson was saying to them, it was having a visible effect, turning concerned citizens into active conspirators. We need to get closer, Tom decided. We need to hear what he's actually telling these people. That evening, as darkness fell over Cedar Falls, Tom and Ayanna made their way through the shadows toward the Grand Hotel, where Henderson had taken up residence in the finest suite available. The hotel sat at the center of town, a 3-story brick building that served as headquarters for whatever passed for government in this remote corner of Oregon Territory. Getting inside required all of Tom's knowledge of the building's construction and Ayanna's natural stealth. The hotel had been built by the same company that constructed Tom's cabin, and he knew that the ventilation system included a network of ducts that connected all the major rooms. Access was through the basement, where the furnace and water systems created enough noise to mask any sounds they might make. The basement was a maze of pipes, machinery, and storage rooms that smelled of coal dust and machine oil. Tom led the way through the mechanical spaces with the confidence of someone who had helped install some of the equipment during the hotel's construction. The ventilation ducts were larger than he remembered, easily big enough for 2 people to crawl through if they were careful and quiet. This feels like something from a children's adventure story, Ayanna whispered as they made their way through the narrow metal passages, crawling through secret tunnels to spy on the villains. Let's hope it doesn't end like most of those stories, Tom replied grimly. The heroes in children's tales don't usually get hanged for treason. The duct system brought them to a grate that overlooked Henderson's suite, where the supposed deputy marshal was meeting with 3 other men Tom didn't recognize. The conversation that drifted up through the ventilation system made Tom's blood run cold. The territorial militia is almost ready to move, Henderson was saying as he poured whiskey for his companions. Another week of propaganda, and they'll be begging us to authorize a full-scale campaign against every tribe in the region. One of the other men, a portly figure with a diamond stickpin in his cravat, leaned forward eagerly. And the contracts? Already signed, Henderson replied with satisfaction. The government will pay premium prices for weapons, ammunition, horses, and supplies. Everything purchased through Pacific Development Corporation, naturally, with appropriate commissions for all parties involved. Tom felt Ayanna tense beside him as the implications became clear. The Indian scare wasn't just about stirring up racial hatred, it was about money. Someone had figured out how to turn fear and violence into a profitable business model, with the federal government footing the bill for an unnecessary war. What about the railroad surveys? Asked a third man. This one with the weathered look of someone who spent his time outdoors. The Northern Pacific is getting impatient about clearing the right-of-way through Sioux territory. Henderson smiled coldly. Once we have our war, every tribe in the region will be relocated or eliminated. The railroad will have a clear path from the Columbia River to the Dakota Territory, and Pacific Development will own the land rights to everything in between. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its callousness. These men weren't just profiteering from conflict, they were manufacturing it from whole cloth, creating the very dangers they claimed to be fighting against. Tom thought about all the innocent people who would die if their plan succeeded, both white settlers and Indian families caught up in a war that served no purpose except enriching a handful of Eastern businessmen. There's one loose end we need to address, the portly man said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. This lumberjack McCready and his Indian woman. They've disappeared completely, but they could cause problems if they surface at the wrong time. Collins is still looking for them, Henderson replied dismissively. But even if they do turn up, who's going to believe a traitor and a savage over federal authorities? We'll simply say they're part of the Indian conspiracy, maybe even the ringleaders of the whole operation. What if they have evidence? The outdoor man pressed. What if they saw something during the Whitmore incident that could contradict our version of events? Henderson's expression darkened. Then we'll make sure they don't live long enough to present that evidence. Collins has authorization to shoot on sight, and accidents happen all the time during Indian fighting. Tom had heard enough. The casual way these men discussed murder and genocide made his stomach turn, and he could feel Ayanna trembling with rage beside him. They needed to get this information to someone in authority, someone who could stop the conspiracy before it exploded into full-scale war. But as they began to carefully retreat through the ventilation system, disaster struck. The metal duct beneath Tom's weight gave way with a grinding screech, sending him tumbling through the ceiling of a storage room below. He landed hard among boxes of hotel linens, the crash echoing through the building like a thunderclap. "Tom!" Ayanna called out in alarm, but he was already rolling to his feet, checking for injuries and grabbing her hand to pull her down from the damaged duct above them. They could hear Henderson's voice barking orders. "Search every room. Someone was listening to our conversation." "We need to move," Tom said urgently, leading Ayanna through the storage room toward what he hoped was an exit. The basement was suddenly alive with the sound of running feet and shouting voices as Henderson's men mobilized to find the intruders. They made it as far as the hotel's back door before running into trouble. Two armed men were waiting in the alley, apparently positioned there to cut off any escape attempt. Tom recognized one of them as Collins, the sergeant who had searched his cabin, but the other was a stranger with the cold eyes of a professional. "Killer. Well, Collins said with vicious satisfaction. "Tom McCready and his pet Indian, just like we figured. Henderson's going to be real pleased when we drag you upstairs." Tom pushed Ayanna behind him, his mind racing as he calculated distances and angles. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with no obvious escape route and no help coming. But surrender meant death, both for them and for all the innocent people who would die in Henderson's manufactured war. "Sergeant Collins," Tom said carefully, "you're being used. Henderson isn't a real deputy marshal, and this whole Indian scare is a fraud designed to start a war that will make rich men richer." Collins laughed harshly. "Nice try, McCready, but we heard your little spy mission upstairs. You're the one who's been working with the Indians, probably feeding them information about patrol routes and supply movements. Think about it." Tom pressed desperately. "When has Whitmore's patrol been found? Where are the bodies? Why haven't any of the other Indian attacks left evidence that can be verified?" For just a moment, Tom thought he saw doubt flicker in Collins's eyes. But then the other man, the professional killer, stepped forward with his gun drawn. "Enough talk," the stranger said coldly. "Henderson wants them alive for questioning, but he'll settle for dead if necessary." That's when Ayanna acted, moving with the lightning speed that had kept her alive through the massacre and its aftermath. She grabbed a handful of dirt from the alley and flung it into the killer's eyes. As he cursed and stumbled backward, she snatched a piece of broken brick from the ground and hurled it at Collins with deadly accuracy. The brick caught Collins in the temple, dropping him like a sack of grain. Tom didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged forward and grappled with the blinded gunman, using his superior size and strength to wrestle the weapon away before the man could clear his vision. "This way," Ayanna called, already moving toward the mouth of the alley where their horses waited hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. They had learned the value of always having an escape route planned, and tonight that preparation saved their lives. Behind them, the hotel erupted in chaos as Henderson's men realized their quarry was escaping. Shouts and gunshots filled the night air, but Tom and Ayanna were already mounted and riding hard toward the forest, using darkness and their knowledge of the local terrain to stay ahead of pursuit. They didn't stop until they reached a hidden camp they had prepared in the mountains, a place where they could rest and plan their next move. As they sat by a carefully concealed fire, sharing jerky and cold coffee, both of them were quiet with the weight of what they had discovered. "It's worse than we thought," Ayanna said finally. "They're not just trying to steal land or make money from army contracts. They're planning to wipe out entire nations of people, generations of families and cultures." Tom nodded grimly. "And they're using the government's own fear and prejudice to do it. Every person who dies in this war will be a victim of their greed." "What can we do?" Ayanna asked. "We have no proof except our word, and as Henderson said, who's going to believe? A traitor and a savage over federal authorities." Tom stared into the fire, his mind working through possibilities and obstacles. They needed evidence, something concrete that would expose the conspiracy to people with the power to stop it. But more than that, they needed allies, people who could spread the truth faster than Henderson could spread his lies. "The people of the Lost Trails," Tom said suddenly. "Joseph Running Wolf and his people have contacts throughout the territory, connections to tribes and traders, and even some government officials who still believe in justice. If we can get word to them, they could spread the truth to every tribe in the region," Ayanna finished, her eyes lighting up with hope. "And if the tribes know this is all a lie, they won't respond to Henderson's provocations the way he expects." "More than that," Tom continued, his excitement growing. "Some of those tribal leaders have relationships with honest officials in the territorial government, people who would investigate if they knew what to look for." It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. Tom and Ayanna spent the rest of the night planning their return to Devil's Canyon, knowing that they would have to move fast before Henderson's conspiracy reached the point of no return. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tom looked at Ayanna and saw his own determination reflected in her dark eyes. They had uncovered a truth that could prevent a war, but sharing that truth would require them to risk everything they had fought so hard to protect. "Are you ready for this?" Tom asked quietly. "Once we start down this path, there's no going back. We'll be fighting not just Henderson and his men, but the fear and hatred they've planted in people's hearts." Ayanna reached for his hand, her fingers strong and sure as they intertwined with his. "My people have a saying, the truth is like water, it always finds a way to flow downhill. Henderson's lies may seem strong now, but truth has a power that greed can never match." Tom squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her courage and wisdom. "Then let's make sure the truth flows like a flood." As they prepared to leave their mountain sanctuary, both of them knew they were riding toward the most dangerous confrontation of their lives. Henderson's conspiracy had momentum and money, and the weight of government authority behind it. But Tom and Ayanna had something more powerful. They had the truth, and they had each other. The war for the soul of the Oregon Territory was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether love and justice could triumph over fear and greed. The odds were against them, but as Ayanna had said, truth has a power that no amount of money can buy. Now, they just had to survive long enough to set that truth free. The smoke signals rose from 3 different peaks at dawn, spelling out a message in the ancient language of the high country that would be understood by every tribe within 100 miles. Joseph Running Wolf had received Tom and Ayanna's warning, and now the truth was spreading like wildfire through the network of Native American communities that Henderson's conspiracy had tried so hard to manipulate. From their position on Eagle's Rest, the highest point in the Cascade foothills, Tom and Ayanna watched as answering signals appeared on distant mountains. The people of the Lost Trails had become something more. They were now the heart of a communication network that connected dozens of tribal groups across the territory, all united by the knowledge that they were being used as pawns in someone else's game. "Look," Ayanna pointed toward the eastern horizon, where a line of dust indicated approaching riders. "That will be Chief Standing Bear of the Yakama. Joseph Running Wolf said he would come if the message was true." Tom lowered his spyglass, having counted at least 30 mounted warriors making their way up the mountain trails toward the secret gathering place. Similar groups had been arriving all morning, delegations from tribes that were supposed to be enemies, all brought together by the revelation that their conflicts were being orchestrated by outside forces. "This is either going to work brilliantly or get us all killed," Tom observed grimly. "If Henderson finds out about this gathering, ... He won't," Ayanna said with quiet confidence. "My people have been hiding from soldiers for generations. We know how to be invisible when we need to be." The gathering that took place in the hidden valley behind Eagle's Rest was unlike anything Tom had ever witnessed. Chiefs and war leaders who had been bitter enemies for decades sat around the same council fire, listening with growing anger as Joseph Running Wolf shared the intelligence that Tom and Ayanna had gathered. The conspiracy that Henderson had assumed would divide and conquer the tribes was instead uniting them in common cause. Chief Standing Bear, a massive man with arms like tree trunks and scars that told the story of a lifetime spent fighting, spoke. For many when he rose to address the council, "For too long, we have danced to the white man's music, fighting each other while they steal our land and corrupt our children. This Henderson and his Pacific Company have shown us the truth. They see us not as enemies, but as obstacles to be removed for profit." White Dove stood next, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived the Nez Perce War and lived to tell the tale. "But knowing the truth is only the beginning. How do we stop them? How do we expose their lies to people who want to believe that we are savages?" The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated, but Tom was struck by the intelligence and strategic thinking of these leaders who were often dismissed as ignorant barbarians by white society. These were people who had been fighting asymmetric warfare against superior forces for decades, and they understood better than any army manual how to turn an enemy's strengths against them. "Henderson's plan depends on fear," observed Running Wolf thoughtfully. "He needs the white settlers to believe they are under constant threat, that only a war of extermination can make them safe. But what if we could show them something different?" The plan that emerged from the council was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of responding to Henderson's provocations with violence, the allied tribes would do the opposite. They would demonstrate their peaceful intentions in ways that couldn't be ignored or misinterpreted. Trade delegations would visit every settlement in the territory, offering goods and services that showed the economic benefits of cooperation over conflict. Chiefs would request meetings with territorial officials, presenting evidence of the conspiracy and demanding investigation. But the most crucial element of the plan would fall to Tom, as the only white man in the alliance who could move freely through settler communities. He would need to return to Cedar Falls and somehow present the evidence they had gathered to people with the authority to act on it. "It's a death sentence," Ayanna said flatly when the plan was explained to them. "Henderson will have every approach to town watched, and the moment you show your face, you'll be shot as a traitor." "Maybe," Tom acknowledged. "But there are people in Cedar Falls who knew me before this madness started, people who might listen if I can reach them. And without someone on the inside, all the evidence in the world won't matter." The war party that Henderson had been trying to provoke never materialized. Instead, as Tom made his way back towards Cedar Falls through forest paths he had walked 1,000 times, he found the countryside filled with something unprecedented: Indians and whites working together. Trade caravans moved along the main roads under joint escort, while mixed hunting parties shared campsites and cooking fires. The sight that greeted him as he approached the outskirts of town was even more remarkable. The barricades that had turned Cedar Falls into an armed camp were still there, but they were unmanned. Instead of fearful settlers scanning the tree line for hostile warriors, Tom saw children playing in the streets while their parents conducted business with tribal delegations in the town square. Henderson's carefully constructed atmosphere of terror had evaporated like morning mist, replaced by something that looked almost like a festival. The conspiracy that was supposed to have triggered a war had instead created the most peaceful period in the territory's recent history. Tom made his way toward the Grand Hotel, where he hoped to find Territorial Representative William Hayes, the one honest official who might have the authority to act on the evidence they had gathered. But as he approached the building, he realized something was very wrong. The hotel was surrounded by armed men, not the usual civilian militia, but professional soldiers who carried themselves with the discipline of regular army troops. "MacCready!" The voice cracked like a whip across the town square, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. Henderson stood on the hotel's front porch, flanked by a dozen men in blue uniforms, who looked like they had seen serious combat. "How convenient of you to save us the trouble of hunting you down." Tom stopped in the middle of the street, acutely aware that he was surrounded, but determined not to show fear. "Henderson, or should I say, whatever your real name is, I don't think you're really a deputy marshal any more than you're an honest man." Henderson's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass, perceptive as always. "No, Mr. MacCready, I'm not a deputy marshal. I'm Colonel Marcus Henderson of the 7th Cavalry, and these are my men. We've been tracking you and your Indian friends for quite some time." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. Henderson wasn't just a corrupt civilian official. He was a serving military officer using his position to stage false flag operations and profit from the chaos that resulted. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than they had imagined. "Your army," Tom said slowly, understanding flooding through him. "You've been using military resources to stage the attacks you've been blaming on the tribes." "Very good," Henderson replied mockingly. "Though you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Did you really think a few civilians could organize something of this scope? The Pacific Development Corporation has contracts with the War Department, worth millions of dollars, and certain officers have been very well compensated for ensuring those contracts are fulfilled." Around the town square, Tom could see civilians beginning to understand what they were witnessing. The revelation that their protector was actually the source of their danger was spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond, creating confusion and anger in equal measure. "People of Cedar Falls," Tom called out, raising his voice so it would carry across the square. "This man has been lying to you. There is no Indian uprising, no threat to your families. Henderson and his company have been staging attacks to justify a war that will make them rich while your sons die fighting a manufactured enemy." The crowd's murmur grew louder, but Henderson's soldiers raised their weapons, creating a barrier of steel between Tom and the people he was trying to reach. "Enough," Henderson snarled. "Seize him." That's when the real cavalry arrived. "Chief." Standing Bear and 30 Yakama warriors emerged from the surrounding buildings, where they had been waiting in concealment, their weapons trained on Henderson's soldiers. At the same time, White Dove and a group of Nez Perce women stepped out of the crowd of civilians, revealing that the town square was filled with far more Indians than anyone had realized. Colonel Henderson, Standing Bear, called out in perfect English, "You are surrounded by people you have wronged, and witnessed by people you have deceived. Surrender now, and you will be given the fair trial you have denied so many others." Henderson's face went white as he realized his situation had reversed completely. His men were outnumbered and surrounded, with nowhere to run and no way to fight. Their way out without massacring civilians in full view of witnesses. "You have no authority here," Henderson blustered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I am a federal officer acting under orders from Washington." "Show us those orders," demanded a new voice from the crowd. Tom turned to see Territorial Representative William Hayes pushing through the crowd, his face grim with determination. "Show us the documentation that authorizes you to stage false attacks and murder innocent people." Henderson's hand moved toward his sidearm, but the click of dozens of weapons being cocked made him freeze. He was trapped, and everyone in the square knew it. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, an old woman's voice called out, "Show us the proof, Mr. McCready." "Show us what?" "You found." Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out the documents he and Ayanna had stolen from the hotel. Papers that detailed the conspiracy's scope and Henderson's role in it. As he began reading from the contracts and correspondence that proved the conspiracy, the crowd's anger shifted from the imaginary Indian threat to the very real threat of government corruption. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," Tom concluded, "you have been lied to, manipulated, and used as tools in someone else's scheme for profit. The choice is yours: continue to be victims of their deception, or stand up for the truth that can set us all free." The crowd's response was immediate and decisive. Instead of the war Henderson had tried to manufacture, they chose justice. Henderson and his conspirators were arrested by their own neighbors, while the tribal leaders who had been painted as enemies were welcomed as allies in the fight against corruption. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Tom found himself standing beside Ayanna in the town square that had been transformed from a place of fear into a symbol of hope. The conspiracy that was supposed to have destroyed the peace had instead created something new, a community where people were judged by their actions rather than their ancestry. "Is it over?" Ayanna asked quietly. Tom looked around at the scene of former enemies working together to build something better. "This part is over, but the real work is just beginning." 6 months after the exposure of Henderson's conspiracy, the Oregon Territory had become something unprecedented in American history, a place where two cultures were learning to build a future together rather than destroy each other's past. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate, but it had been real, measurable in small daily victories that added up to something miraculous. Tom McCready stood on the porch of his new home, watching the sun rise over a valley that bore little resemblance to the one he had known a year ago. Where once there had been only his lonely logging camp, now there was a thriving community called Harmony Creek, a settlement built jointly by white families, seeking a fresh start in tribal groups, looking for a place to adapt to the changing world without abandoning their heritage. The house itself was a symbol of that new cooperation, built with traditional Sioux techniques for harmony with the land, but using modern tools and materials that made it comfortable for year-round habitation. Tom had designed it with help from Ayanna's cousin, a master builder named Joseph Crow Feather, who had become one of his closest friends, despite their initial wariness of each other. "The delegation from Washington will arrive this afternoon," Ayanna said as she joined him on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a dress that beautifully combined Sioux beadwork with contemporary styling. "Are you nervous about testifying before the Territorial Commission?" Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, still marveling at how natural it felt to share these quiet morning moments with someone who understood both his past and his hopes for the future. A little. It's one thing to expose corruption to local officials, but when senators and territorial governors get involved, the stakes become much higher. The commission that was coming to investigate Henderson's conspiracy represented the federal government's official response to the scandal that had rocked the territory. Tom's testimony would be crucial in ensuring that the reforms they had fought for would become permanent law rather than temporary expediency. "You'll do fine," Ayanna assured him, settling beside him on the wooden bench they had built together. "You have something that politicians rarely encounter, the absolute truth, backed by evidence they can't dispute." The evidence in question sat locked in the Territorial Bank's vault, a collection of documents, recorded testimonies, and financial records that painted a comprehensive picture of how private interests had tried to manipulate government policy for profit. Henderson himself was awaiting trial in the territorial capital, along with a dozen co-conspirators whose arrests had sent shockwaves through military and business circles as far away as Washington, D.C. But the legal proceedings, important as they were, represented only one dimension of the change that had swept through the region. The real transformation could be seen in the daily life of communities like Harmony Creek, where children who had been taught to fear each other were now learning to play together, and where adults were discovering that cooperation produced better results than conflict. "Tom!" A young voice called out across the settlement's main street, and both Tom and Ayanna turned to see running deer, Joseph Crowfeather's 10-year-old son, racing toward them with the boundless energy of childhood. "Tom, my father says to tell you the new mill wheel is ready for testing." The mill wheel represented one of Harmony Creek's most ambitious projects, a sawmill designed to process timber, using both traditional respect for the forest and modern efficiency techniques. It would provide lumber for the growing community while ensuring that harvesting was sustainable and environmentally responsible. "Tell your father I'll be right there," Tom replied, ruffling the boy's hair in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. 6 months ago, the idea of casual physical affection between a white man and an Indian child would have been scandalous in most of the territory. Now it was simply part of the fabric of daily life in their community. As running deer scampered away, Tom found himself reflecting on how much his own perspective had changed. The man who had fled to the Oregon wilderness to escape human connection had discovered that isolation wasn't healing. It was just another form of death. Real healing came from building something meaningful with people who shared your values, regardless of where they had been born or what language they spoke at home. "I have news too," Ayanna said quietly, her voice carrying a note that made Tom turn to look at her more carefully. "From Dr. Matthews in Cedar Falls. The examination confirmed what I suspected." Tom's heart stopped for a moment as he processed the implications of her words. Dr. Matthews was the territorial doctor who had been treating the health needs of both communities, and Ayanna had visited him the previous week for reasons she had been mysteriously reluctant to discuss. "Ayanna," Tom said slowly, "are you telling me that we single quotes going to have a child?" she finished, her dark eyes sparkling with a mixture of joy and nervousness. "A baby who will grow up in a world where his parents' love story isn't a scandal but a symbol of hope." Tom felt as if the sun had suddenly become twice as bright, filling his chest with warmth that had nothing to do with the morning weather. He pulled Ayanna into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious crystal, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just shared with him. "A child," he repeated wonderingly. "Our child. Born free of all the hatred and fear that tried to keep us apart." "She," Ayanna corrected with a smile. "I'm certain it's a girl. And I want to name her Mary, if that's all right with you. After your first wife, the woman whose memory helped you become the man who could save me." Tom felt tears spring to his eyes at her generosity, her understanding that honoring his past didn't diminish their future. "Mary Ayanna McCready," he said, testing the sound of it. "A name that bridges two worlds." "Just like her parents," Ayanna agreed, leaning against his chest with contentment that spoke of absolute trust and shared dreams. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment of private celebration, and Tom looked up to see a familiar figure riding toward their home. Chief Standing Bear approached with the dignity that had made him such an effective leader during the crisis, but his weathered face showed signs of weariness that spoke of long negotiations and difficult decisions. "Tom, Ayanna," Standing Bear said as he dismounted, "I bring news from the territorial capital. The commission has reached its preliminary conclusions." Tom and Ayanna exchanged glances, both knowing that the chief's expression suggested the news wasn't entirely positive. "Henderson and his immediate conspirators will face trial for treason, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder," Standing Bear continued. "But the Pacific Development Corporation itself has been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation with the investigation. They'll pay fines and restitution, but no one else will face criminal charges." Tom felt his jaw clench with frustration. The corporate interests that had funded and profited from Henderson's conspiracy would escape with financial penalties that were probably less than their illegal profits, while the human cost of their greed had been measured in lives destroyed and communities torn apart. However, Standing Bear continued, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. The territorial legislature has passed new laws that will make such conspiracies much more difficult in the future. All military contractors must now submit to independent auditing. Tribal representatives will sit on territorial planning commissions, and mixed communities like Harmony Creek will receive federal protection against interference. The legal victory was incomplete, but significant, establishing precedents that would protect future generations from the kind of manipulation they had experienced. More importantly, it represented official recognition that cooperation between cultures was not only possible, but beneficial for everyone involved. "There's something else," Standing Bear added, his expression becoming more personal. "The territorial governor has asked me to extend an invitation to both of you. He wants Tom to serve as the territory's first director of cultural integration, helping to establish similar communities throughout the region." Tom blinked in surprise. "He wants me to work for the government? After everything that's happened?" "He wants you to help change the government," Standing Bear corrected, "to ensure that what happened here in Harmony Creek becomes the model for territorial policy rather than the exception to it." Tom looked at Ayanna, seeing his own conflicted feelings reflected in her eyes. The opportunity to influence policy on a territorial scale was tempting, but it would also mean leaving the community they had worked so hard to build. "We don't have to decide today," Ayanna said gently. "Our child won't be born for months yet, and Harmony Creek will always be here for us to return to." As the afternoon wore on and the federal commission arrived to take Tom's testimony, he found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a broken man hiding from life in the wilderness, consumed by grief and isolation. The decision to save one starving young woman had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just his own life, but the entire territory. The commissioners listened with grave attention as Tom recounted the details of Henderson's conspiracy, presenting evidence that would ensure the corrupt colonel spent the rest of his life in prison. But even as he testified about corruption and violence, Tom found his thoughts turning to hope and possibility, to the child that would soon be born into a world where love could triumph over hatred. That evening, as Harmony Creek celebrated both the legal victory and the McCready family's happy news, Tom stood once again on his porch with Ayanna beside him. The settlement spread out below them in the gathering dusk, lights beginning to twinkle in windows where families of different backgrounds were sharing meals and stories and dreams for the future. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found you that day in the forest?" Tom asked quietly. Ayanna considered the question seriously. "I think the Great Spirit puts people in each other's paths for reasons we don't always understand at the time. You saved my life, but I think maybe I saved yours too. We saved each other, and that gave us the strength to save others." Tom nodded, understanding that their love story was ultimately about more than just two people finding each other. It was about the power of compassion to overcome prejudice, of courage to challenge injustice, and of hope to build bridges across the deepest divides. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Tom McCready and Ayanna looked toward a future that they would build together, one child, one family, one act of kindness at a time. The wilderness that had once been their refuge had become their home, and the love that had begun with a desperate rescue had grown into something that would change the world. In the end, that was perhaps the most powerful truth of all, that love, real love, was never just about the two people who shared it. True love always reached beyond itself, creating ripples of hope and healing that could transform entire communities and generations yet to come. The hunt was finally over. The real adventure was just beginning.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.